It's the week ending Saturday, the 4th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the sacking of Nadeem Zahawi as chair of the Conservative Party after breaching the ministerial code, the recovery after a 6-day search of a tiny radioactive capsule lost in Western Australia, and golf world number one Rory McIlroy winning the Desert Classic for the 3rd time. You can read more about all of that in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll from daily podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors. It's Arion McNicoll, and we have writer and comedian Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that secret documents became America's worst-kept secret?
Yeah, I think we've been pretty transparent from the very beginning with providing information as it occurs throughout this process. You know, we have released probably thousands of words of statements from the president's personal attorney and the White House counsel's office about the process that has been undertaken here, that process that has been fully coordinated with the Justice Department.
Biden spokesperson Ian Sams outside the White House on Wednesday. Arion, what's the process he's talking about?
Okay, well, the story is all about this growing problem of classified documents showing up in the homes of presidents and vice presidents, both past and present. And a few things have happened recently. First of all, a new tranche of classified documents showed up in Mike Pence's home, former vice president to Donald Trump. And then this week, a search of Joe Biden's beach home was carried out, but found nothing. That's what we were hearing about just then. Though previously, some documents were found in Biden's other home. But the underreported bit of the tale this week is that the US National Archives, which is an independent agency that preserves the country's historical documents, has asked all recent former presidents and vice presidents to look through their personal records for any of these rogue documents that they shouldn't have.
Julia, what took them so long?
It's a good question because legally, presidents, vice presidents are legally obliged to return any documents that they had, particularly classified information, to the National Archives when they leave office.
Okay, so that is good. That is part of the process. It's supposed to be part of the process anyway. When you're not president anymore, you give back the classified stuff.
Absolutely. So obviously people weren't specifically looking for it because they had assumed that the due process had been followed.
I mean, is this an overreaction, do you think, Suchandrika, to the Trump situation? Because in his case, 15 boxes of classified documents were recovered from Mar-a-Lago. A dozen? That's the kind of number we're seeing on Biden and Pence, isn't it? A dozen or so old documents accidentally undestroyed. It's not quite the same thing, is it? I mean, it's obviously not desirable, but it's not the same.
No, it does seem like the Trump situation has led the agency to fear the image is being tarnished, although we know that with Trump it is a unusual situation and it's unlikely that other former presidents and vice presidents would have this level of classified documents in their homes, and also would be so unwilling to give them up, because that's the other important part of this, is that Trump is being very difficult to deal with as opposed to Pence and Biden.
So what are the security measures in place, Arion, if you're the president of the USA or the vice president and you take some documents home?
Well, it seems to be pretty open that if you are a president, you're allowed to have documents in whatever place you want. You're the boss and you're pretty much allowed to handle these classified documents because they are all open to you in whatever way you wish. However, the problem is that after you are done with them, you're expected to give them back, and also you're meant to keep them in ways that are secure so that they are not vulnerable. And I think the problem, well, there's a couple of problems that are emerging here. In the case of Biden himself, the documents that were found that he possessed were stuffed into an old garage of his in his Delaware home. He said that they were, in the most precious place in his house next to his prized Corvette, and so therefore they were being, looked after sufficiently well. In Donald Trump's case, as Suchandrika was saying, it's slightly different because he actively took off with documents after his presidency that were not meant to be in his possession anymore. They're meant to be the possession of the National Archive, and he just took them home. And then not only that, but also he refused to give them back. And we don't know a lot about what was in these documents, but we do know that they had among them, for example, information about an unnamed country's nuclear program. This was not the sort of information that should just be in the hands of someone who is now a private citizen after all, though, for how long, depending on if his presidential comeback is successful. But the idea is that basically you're meant to give over everything that was involved in your presidency after you leave to the National Archive so that they can basically, keep track of it, but also control this classified documentation in a way that it doesn't get out.
It still seems surprisingly relaxed to me, Julia. I know he's president, and I know they have a very deferential system. And, whatever the president wants to do, he runs the country, he can do. If he wants to read a confidential document in the bath, he can. But should he be able to, really? Shouldn't it be much, much clearer? When you read classified documents, sir, you go into this room in your house where we have security, and then they shred the document afterwards. It's not that hard to implement.
It does feel like that should be the case. And part of the issue is that too many documents, people say, are classified in America. So it's thought that more than 50 million documents a year are currently classified. So how on earth could you keep track of that? It's a huge amount. And there seems to be this kind of better safe than sorry attitude around it, where there wouldn't be a penalty for classifying something or over classifying. But obviously, if you underclassify a piece of sensitive information and then it turned into a much more serious situation, that could become a issue of national security. But I was reading, there was a piece of former special counsel at the Pentagon, Una Hathaway. She estimated that only 5 to 10% of classified documents actually warrant classification. So there's become this kind of more casual attitude, I feel, around classification, that perhaps it just isn't being taken as seriously.
Have you got any examples of documents that have been classified then that we might be surprised are classified? Because you hear the word classified, you do sort of think nuclear codes, don't you, rather than 50 million government documents?
Yeah, so here's an example of extreme classification where maybe it wasn't necessary. So there's a cable leak by Chelsea Manning, and an official had marked details of wedding rituals in the Russian region of Dagestan as, quotes, confidential, as if most such details were not already well known in the region of more than 3 million people, because weddings are fairly public and traditions handed down from generation to generation. So it does seem like someone was overcompensating a bit there, because as Julia's mentioning, you don't want to underclassify in case something becomes a matter of national security. So if you underclassify a piece of information or a document, then your job is in peril. So obviously people want to overclassify documents and sensitive information, as they have done in this case with the wedding rituals.
But if you're in American politics because you believe in the American way of life, Arion, and we have to believe that some people like that exist, then surely you believe in open reporting, don't you? You believe in access to information for journalists and therefore the general public as a result of that. And by classifying things, you're keeping things out of the public domain.
Yes and no. I think that the question of how much states should engage in secrecy is a really live and difficult one in democracies all around the world. I mean, the whole business with overclassification, the reason why some people say this is bad is because, I suppose what you're driving at, it keeps potentially relevant information from the public. There's things that we all want to know that if you overclassify, then we can't know. It also makes it difficult for agencies to share information with one another and work together. And also, as we're finding in all of these cases, it can be hard to keep track of all of these classified documents because who knows where they're going to show up. But I think that question about what governments should keep secret and what they shouldn't is sort of illustrated nicely by the cables released by Chelsea Manning that Suchandrika just mentioned. It wasn't just that stuff about weddings and Dagestan, it was much broader than that. And quite a lot of the stuff was, on the one hand, you had things that people would say it's important for us not to have come out, like the information of, say, about foreign informants who have worked with the US government, whose lives are then in danger because they continue to live in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever they are, that they were informing on people around them, and now their lives are at risk. But on the other hand, some of the information that Chelsea Manning leaked included, video footage that showed US helicopters in a fatal attack on people in Baghdad, which turned out to be civilians. And that disclosure led to watchdogs radically re-estimating the number of people who had been killed by American armed forces for as much as by like 10,000 more civilian deaths than we had previously known about. So there are things that when the government doesn't tell you about it, then you have a less nuanced picture about the world around you that arguably for people who want to get that information out is important. But on the other hand, there are lives that are put at risk potentially by leaking that stuff.
Yeah, and I suppose those electronic leaks, Julia, maybe go some way to answering the question, why is so much stuff on paper still? Because you're sort of tempted to think, well, it's because Biden's pushing 80. That's why everything's on paper. And, a younger president could cope with a Kindle that wipes itself. But actually, I guess once it's digital, it's easier to leak.
Yeah, I think that is true. And it would be easy to assume that, it would be safer if it's online. But I think actually nowadays that it probably is more dangerous. But then it comes into that question again of how is there not a designated space where particularly top secret information needs to be accessed by particular people. I remember hearing about an MP who was saying that, there would be some documents that were so classified they would have to log in to a particular room, write their name, how long they were in there. And it was all tracked who had access to that information. And I mean, you would hope that there are some instances where that would be the same in the US, but it does seem like there's a big disparity there.
So there have been efforts made to try and legislate around this situation because it's a tricky thing for a president to become a private citizen. And as a private citizen, they may well be talking about their time in office, and this could be a reason for them to hang on to information. During the Obama era, they tried to bring in legislation to make sure that the blurred lines were actually made into hard lines. So in 2010, Obama signed the Reducing Overclassification Act, but according to experts, it didn't solve the problem. One of the reasons could be because the term overclassification wasn't defined properly, so it was hard to actually enforce the legislation and work out what should fall under it and what shouldn't, which is a bit of a shame. So they did try.
The point of this show, Arion, as we say in the intro each week, is to bring people stories that have implications for them. I can't work out how here in Europe this does have implications for us, beyond the fact that obviously the United States is an important player. I can't work out either if the reason we don't hear much about our own politicians leaking classified documents is because we're either more relaxed about this or less relaxed.
I think we're not less relaxed. The UK government has its own classifications policy, which divides things into 3 levels: top secret, secret, and official, all of which have to be written in caps, incidentally, when they're put on the tops of documents, I guess, so people know how important they are. But, there are actually documented cases around the world of people in official positions doing similar things. Maxime Bernier, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, was forced to resign in 2008 when his then girlfriend went on television and said that he had left secret documents in her apartment. The press had a field day with that, as you might expect. And then in 2011, I don't know if you remember, but UK Minister Oliver Letwin was admonished when a picture emerged of him dumping government documents in the rubbish. So this is stuff that goes on everywhere. And I think it is important at moments like this for us to ask 2 questions. One, is this a case of government irresponsibility or indeed personal irresponsibility? And 2, are we just having too many things kept secret from us? And I think the answer certainly in the US is, it seems to be a sort of resounding yes. 50 million per year is just a lot of things to be kept secret from us. So, it's one to consider.
Okay. Julia, you're up next after this. Okay, Julia, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A complicated case of restitution.
The painting belongs to Mrs. Almond's family.
She is the Mona Lisa of Austria.
We will fight you till the end for something we believe is ours.
They destroyed my family. They killed my friends. And they forced me to abandon the people and the places that I love. I won't let them humiliate me again.
You're going to file a lawsuit.
We're taking the Austrian government to court. Have a nice day.
The trailer for the 2015 film Woman in Gold. Julia, thank you for bringing us a bit of showbiz sparkle there. Ryan Reynolds, Helen Mirren. What's that got to do with the week's news?
So The Woman in Gold is a film about a true story. A woman who in the late 1990s, early 2000s, brought a lawsuit against the Austrian authorities claiming that she was the rightful owner of Gustav Klimt's Woman in Gold. And she won that case. And so a similar story has caught my eye this week. It's about who rightfully owns a Pablo Picasso masterpiece called Woman Ironing. It's quite a complicated case in that the person who originally bought it, Karl Adler, purchased it in 1916 from a gallery in Munich. And 22 years later, he sold it back to the gallery owner's son for what the claimants are now saying was well below what it was worth. And so Adler's relatives are now suing for financial loss. The gallery owner son left the painting along with a number of other works to the Guggenheim Foundation, and it's been there since 1978. And so the Guggenheim are saying that no, it rightfully belongs to them, and Adler's relatives are claiming that it's theirs.
Yes, and listening to that version of it, it sounds pretty clear-cut, doesn't it? Bloke sold the painting, now grandchildren say the painting is somehow owed to them. But the important context here, Julia, is that Karl Adler was Jewish and this was Nazi Germany. And he sold the painting as part of the process of his family escaping Nazi Germany and certain death, circumstances under which you'd understand someone's going to take a reduced price on what they're selling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the painting was sold once Adler had already left Germany, which people are now saying could be a problem in terms of his family's lawsuit now.
Because it wasn't absolutely essential money to leave the country.
Exactly. They had already left the country. But the court documents say that Adler and his family needed cash because they needed visas to go through various countries in order to escape persecution. So they went through the Netherlands, France, Switzerland, and eventually ended up in Argentina. So a really long, difficult journey that they needed funds for along the way.
And Suchandrika, what complicates this case even further is this is a couple of generations down now bringing this case. What's interesting to me is that Adler himself and his children never expressed any desire to reclaim this painting or the money for it. They knew it had been sold to the Guggenheim. So why is it coming up now?
So Guggenheim's used that argument as well. They said they reached out to Karl Adler's son, Eric, in the 70s to discuss the painting's provenance, and Eric Adler did not raise any concerns at the time. So there's this really interesting thing around how a perception of what level of crime this is and the background to this is. And it seems to me like in the 1990s, that's when this international conversation around the looting of art, particularly in World War II. It's the biggest looting of art in all of history, what happened in World War II. And the conversation really started happening in the 1990s. So when the Guggenheim spoke to Eric Adler, the son of Karl, in the 70s, they're being a bit disingenuous by bringing that up now because it's a completely different time and place. And these conversations around provenance and also how to track the provenance, they kind of weren't there at the time. So it does feel a bit unfair.
That's so interesting that a conversation about history should be informed by the context in which the conversation's happening rather than when it happened. I mean, it's a clumsy analogy, this, but maybe it's not so far away from some of the sexual harassment conversations we've been having over the last 10 years, where people say this thing that happened to me 50 years ago, because now that would be considered something that someone would go to prison for, even if at the time it's something that happened to you at work. I should have reparation for what happened to me then. I mean, is it just that in the 70s, the conversation about, as you put it, looted art, I mean, in this case, he had sold the art, but art that, as a result of the Holocaust, was traded, just hadn't reached maturity yet?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting analogy of somewhere between Me Too and somewhere between where our conversation about statues is at the moment. And it is about different societies deciding that our values have changed and that we should be looking more closely at these sort of cultural artifacts, where they came from. And I use the word looting, and you're right that in this case it's sold, but was the painting sold under duress? That's a part of the conversation. So the painting was sold to someone called Justin Tannhauser, who's also a very controversial figure. He's been described as someone who just so happened to be in the right place at the right time to take a lot off the hands of Jews desperately fleeing Europe. So those who defend him say he helped these people, but those who criticise him say it is funny how he always seemed to end up with this depressed value art. So you've got to wonder as well, these conversations that are lost to time, how did Tannhauser present himself as possibly someone who was helping save them, but what he was actually doing was profiting over time from these people? And maybe that wasn't that well known back in the 70s, but over time, these stories come to light and people think, well, let's go back and reassess the situation.
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, Arion? Because presumably for Adler himself and his children, the story he brought them up with was essentially this painting saved our family. And yet the grandchildren look at it and say, yeah, but you sold it for a tenth of what it was worth. That's a crime in itself.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a part of the question. And you look back at the history of the painting, and even Adler himself in 1932, so about 10 years before he ended up selling the painting, he'd been looking to offload it for quite a lot more. He obviously was an art dealer who knew the value of things. And so he'd been looking to sell it for $14,000. And in the end, he sold it for $1,500, which would be about the equivalent of $32,000 in today's money. So, significantly less than the artwork was worth even then. And yes, it must be very complicated for the family because it saved their skin, regardless of the price he got for it. He got enough money to get the family out and they all survived. One of the things that sort of feels difficult in this case of restitution is that it seems odd to punish the Guggenheim themselves.
Right. Rather than Germany.
Yeah, well, or the Tannhauser family. The Guggenheim Museum was bequeathed this work. They didn't buy it. They were given it. And now the financial responsibility seems to be falling to them, at least if this case is successful. And it's in the realms now of the value of the artwork is put in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's worth a lot of money. And, the Tannhauser family so far has got off entirely scot-free. They're still credited with this wonderful donation in the Guggenheim, and the Guggenheim is having to foot the bill. So unlike some other cases where, say the Elgin marbles in Britain and the British Museum, the museum in question is somehow fairly directly responsible for the acquisition. They knew what it was all about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the British Museum is the British Museum, and, those marbles are there because Britain took them. But in this case, this particular sale happened because Germany voted for Adolf Hitler. That's why Jews had to flee Germany. And so, I mean, you can have a debate about whether or not reparations should be happening over artwork that was bought over 100 years ago. But surely, if anyone's responsible, it's Germany, not the Guggenheim.
So I think this is the really complex thing about these situations with art and reparations and restitution. So you can say that the price of the painting itself, which is under discussion, was it sold under duress? That takes the price down. That's meaningful. But also, there's this idea of the soft power of culture. Why are paintings, why are pieces of art stolen in the first place? It's not just the market value. It's also a way of saying we are taking the visual representations of your culture and we're sort of placing ours there instead. And can you put a value on that? So I can kind of understand this family saying to the Guggenheim, you've benefited from something that should have remained inside our walls. You've benefited from the cultural power of this beautiful piece of art. You've had people pay to come into your museum. Now we want to have some of that back because our family lost money. We lost a fortune. Now, how do you actually define that and put it into monetary terms? I really don't know, but that is part of how you balance these books. It's not just this painting is worth this much if we sent it to Christie's tomorrow and sold it. It's also this kind of soft power. It's also the value of inheritance and what families accumulate over time. And reparations are meant to address that and assess that, but how they do it is so complex and so full of opinion and nuance, and I think kind of emotion as well.
And something that is coming to the fore in 2023, Julia. It's not just this case, is it? This, you reckon, could be the year of restitution?
Well, some art experts, much more wise on this than me, think so. And one of the reasons is that this is the 25th anniversary of the creation of the Washington Principles. So Suchandrika touched on this earlier, that this conversation around how we deal with art that was looted during the Holocaust and how it's now dealt with. The Washington Principles were created when representatives from 44 different countries came together to create kind of like a guideline and principles of almost like an ethical code of how to deal with these cases. And they recognized looting as a crime against humanity. So it's a really significant moment in this conversation. And as a result, there have been thousands of restitutions since then. So I think the fact that this is happening in the year of the 25th anniversary, at a time when there have been more and more cases, there is greater precedent for people to bring these cases, is not surprising. But whether the cases like this that are so complicated, whether this will prove to be the year of restitution, I guess we have to wait and see.
Okay, so Suchandrika, you're finishing the show after this. Suchandrika, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
We live in a Barbie world and it's becoming more inclusive.
I'm 16 again. Aqua and Barbie Girl. Good luck getting that out of your head today. Suchandrika, they're on tour this summer, apparently. Aqua, do you have tickets?
Yes. No, I didn't know that. But can I say, genuinely, one of my dad's favourite songs back in the day? Really enjoyed it when it was on the radio. Would sing along in the car. Weird.
Immediate appeal as an earworm to all generations. What's the story?
So the story is that Mattel, the company who makes Barbies, is bringing out a doll who has scoliosis and will have a back brace and sort of show visible signs of having this condition. It's not a Barbie doll, but it's her sister Chelsea, who I believe goes to a different school, and you might not know her. So scoliosis is a common, sometimes hereditary spinal condition. It's a curvature of the spine, and it affects 2 to 3% of the population in the US. So it's about 6 to 9 million people. And in the UK, it's a similar percentage, actually. It's 2 to 3%. It's about 70,000 people. So what we're going to have here is really, from childhood, from early on, children seeing that scoliosis and the back brace, which is very visible, that's used to help correct it as the child grows. They're going to have their questions answered by looking at the doll. People who have scoliosis, they'll see themselves represented. And it's sort of joining a large group of diverse Barbie and Ken and Chelsea dolls, which were brought out in the last few years.
This seems very precise, though, very specific. You know, I understand why there was cause to say we need a black Barbie, we need a Barbie in a wheelchair. A Barbie with scoliosis? I mean, was there like a pressure from a particular campaign group or awareness group or something?
So yeah, as far as we can tell, the Chelsea with her scoliosis and her back brace is an addition to an increasingly large range of Barbies and Ken dolls and Chelsea dolls who have sort of visible differences to the original blonde tanned Barbie doll. So you'll have dolls of different ethnicities and also dolls with visible disabilities. So there's a doll who was in a wheelchair who was brought out a couple of years ago, a doll who's an amputee, and with that particular doll, a young girl who was missing part of her arm was brought in to kind of make sure the doll was created in a realistic fashion. So it looks as though Mattel is looking at their range and thinking, how can we be more inclusive, reflects back to children their experience. And also, I will say that these dolls do sell very well too.
Well, yeah, just to be cynical for a second, Arion, I mean, I'm not saying, it's obviously a good thing to have dolls that are more reflective of the world as it is. However, they're effectively limited editions, these ones, aren't they? Because they sell fewer of them. Like the mainstream Barbie is still going to be the biggest selling doll. And so actually what you're doing is you're creating 10 years down the track as a second-hand market for the Barbie with scoliosis, which means more money at the end of the day. There is a commercial imperative for this.
I guess that will be one of the effects, but I'm not sure that that's directly what Mattel will be thinking about, not least because that will benefit the resale market rather than them themselves. I mean, I do think that this is an attempt by Mattel as a company to really just pay penance for years of harm done, quite frankly, by having marketed a product that had this terrible sort of unrealistic and very sort of uniform unachievable body size, and particularly, represented only one kind of mainstream image of womanhood. And I think consequently, ever since the early 2000s, they've been trying to put out dolls that are broadly more representative of what the world actually looks like. And I think this fits into that quite well. I didn't actually realize that scoliosis, which I personally have, by the way, affects as many people as it does. 2 to 3% of the population is an enormous amount. So it's, it's niche in a sense, but it is a thing that you could see why, particularly for people who want for their children to be engaging with, dolls that represent all kinds of people, would be, would tick that box quite well. It's not just another Barbie that's blonde and impossibly tall. This is something slightly different.
Okay, well, all right. You've positioned yourself very well, because you have scoliosis, you have a child who is a girl, and you are impossibly tall. So I can ask you, do you feel better that a scoliosis Barbie brand exists so that you can have that conversation with your daughter and feel represented? Does that actually occur to you?
It didn't for me. I must say I found a woman who wrote a piece for Yahoo Life, a woman called Marie Claire Dorking, who she was talking about the fact that she had to wear a brace for 23 hours a day until she stopped growing at the age of 17. And for her, this was big news, because it really did represent something that she struggled and suffered with for a long time. My form of scoliosis, I must say, was much less dramatic than that, and I didn't have to do too much other than kind of regular exercise to offset it. In terms of the question about having a young daughter, absolutely yes. I love anytime I see her playing with a doll that isn't just, a conventional white normal girl baby doll that you might find in any store. I'm overjoyed. I love the fact that there are more options today than there even were when we were kids, and so I think that this fits into that. The more of these, the better.
But I do just wonder, Julia, whether that's something parents say, because I feel the same. For example, there's a presenter on CBeebies now who has Down syndrome, George. And when I saw him, I was like, wow, that's amazing. He doesn't talk about having Down syndrome. He's just one of the presenters. Makes it easier for me as a parent to talk about disability with my children. Great. But for the children themselves, genuinely, I mean, for all those decades, people played with the original Barbie and they used their imagination. And did they really genuinely feel unrepresented or like they couldn't project other things onto it? They're kids. They play with stuff that doesn't look anything like the real world all the time.
Yes, that's true. But I think, yes, actually, people have felt unrepresented by dolls and toys for a long time. I was thinking about another Barbie doll that came out recently. It was fashioned on Rose Ayling-Ellis, who is an actress who then won Strictly Come Dancing, and she is deaf. And Mattel released a Barbie that was styled on her with visible hearing aids. And obviously it was great marketing for them, a great campaign. But she said in an interview that I thought was really, really stood out, she said that when she was a child and she would play with her Barbie, she would draw a hearing aid onto them.
Yeah, but I suppose that's what I'm getting at in a way, is that is play, isn't it? And so when you have a furry giraffe that doesn't look like a real giraffe, you can sometimes it goes to the moon because you're playing with it.
True, but then I think, why should the norm for these toys be such an unrealistic, as Arion said, unattainable, idealized version of the female form? It just doesn't make sense.
And why is it always about the female form, Suchandrika, when Ken, I note, does not have a dad bod variant?
Because having a dad bod is not a disability, it is aspirational. And I'm not joking.
But I don't feel represented by
I'm
Ken.
not joking at all.
There's only white Ken and black Ken, and he looks, like Zac Efron.
He's just
that's a real question, isn't it? The conversation is always about female body types, but girls play with boy body types that are completely unrealistic as well.
Absolutely true. And I think that there's a question a bit earlier about why particularly scoliosis, and Arion's pointed out that actually it's quite a large amount of the population who might be on a spectrum of scoliosis. As he said, there's a level where there's back braces in childhood, and for Arion, that wasn't your experience. But I'd sort of turn the question around and say, one thing is about representation for the child who might have that condition, but also it's representation for other children who might, when they see something that's visible in terms of disability but don't understand, have lots of questions. And I think for the child who has scoliosis, for instance, to be questioned again and again every single day about the back brace sets them apart, makes them feel different, isolated, and so on. But if you have a doll you can ask questions about and say, well, what's that? How do you take it off? And so on. So you have that doll in a nursery setting and the teacher shows everyone. It just looks really simple and straightforward and possibly a bit cool to have that back brace. So the lovely teal colour, I quite like it. So I think it could be about showing children who have not had health issues and not had to be in and out of hospital perhaps and not had to deal with these things, that actually there are lives who do have that in them, but those children are still fun, interesting, you can play with them, you can maybe be sensitive to their needs, but they are not people to be pointed at or laughed at. It's about empathy.
Yeah, I suppose the very fact that it's being presented in a box as a toy is aspirational in itself, isn't it? I mean, I wonder, Suchandrika, growing up in the UK, where obviously you had friends who were a different colour to you, being brown, did you see them play with toys that were your colour and feel good about that? Or did you never see that?
So I never saw that. And I think this is the difference between being a millennial and a kind of, I'm calling them Generation Alpha, my niece's age, like your kid's age. My niece is turning 5 in April. And I think what's quite interesting is my niece is mixed race, but she is going to look to the world as though she's white. And her parents have put a lot of effort into making sure like the dolls she plays with are of different ethnicities. She's got 2 babies. Again, she's nearly 5, guys. And she's got like twins and they've got 2 different skin tones. And she doesn't see a difference between them. They're twins to her. They're her little babies she puts in buggies. And I think this sort of thing is so important because if you don't see yourself represented at all, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what it does to people. I think I'm still figuring it out. But I don't think it's very healthy to never see yourself represented. And I don't think it's very healthy for other people who might feel like, well, that person with a different skin tone or that person with a visible disability is a mystery to me and therefore extremely different to me, and maybe I shouldn't approach them, or maybe I have to have a very special approach to them. And I do think having dolls like this shows children from an early age this person who has some sort of difference that's visible is perhaps not that meaningful, or I should learn something about it and then I can have empathy, then I can deal with it sensitively. So I do think there is an overall good happening here.
And yet, Barbie is both a brand and a character, isn't she, Julia? And you have some data that says that when it comes to gifting, people prefer the Barbie, the Californian.
So, this came out of some audience research that Barbie, the Barbie brand undertook.
Not Barbie the person, although she can have any career, she could be working in research data.
She was actually in space when the research was conducted.
Yeah.
So basically, Barbie sales dropped massively between 2012 and 2014. And it was when there were a range of other dolls coming out that people thought were just maybe a bit more interesting or a bit more representative. Bratz was cited as one. And so Mattel, as a business, decided to really diversify its looks and introduce new body shapes, and particularly curvier body shapes. The new Barbie shape made the cover of Time magazine. It was widely applauded. But in the focus groups, people were saying, yes, I would buy that Barbie for my daughter. I think that's great. And I think that's a really positive message to be showing them. But actually, I often buy Barbies as gifts for other people's children. They're relatively they don't cost too much. They're kind of generally people like to receive them. But I wouldn't want to buy a curvier Barbie in case the parent then thought I was saying something about the way that their child looks that might be implied. So it's complicated.
That's so interesting, isn't it? I suppose also that in itself might speak to the thing, Arion, that Suchandrika was referring to, that if you've been brought up in a world of conventional Barbies, maybe future generations won't deal with this. You still feel that thing as an adult when you're gifting a Barbie, that it's weird somehow to have the Barbie who looks different. You're making a statement.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But at the same time, it is so useful to have bodies on toys that actually are in some way realistic. I saw this really fascinating piece in ID where they basically were assessing what a real world Barbie based on its traditional characteristics would be like. And
her traditional characteristics.
Sorry, her, thank you. And they said, well, she'd have to crawl around on all fours due to her ankles being unable to support her body, and she'd have a head 6 inches larger than her own waist, which would be so out of proportion notion that you'd have to live without several vital internal organs, for example, half a liver and a few inches of intestine. And I think at the very least, if you have body types that look more like real world humans, I think that's a step in the right direction, regardless of which ones people are giving each other as gifts. I think it's just better to have more body types out there.
Back in the 80s and 90s, I played with the original Barbie, and looking back, I do think that was a harmful body type to be looking at the whole time. It's kind of a cartoon brought to life, but children take everything literally and kind of look at toys like that and think maybe I should be looking like that. I mean, poor Barbie, the original Barbies, couldn't put her feet down. She was always on tiptoe, ready to put her feet into high heels. That's just a minimum. Her body proportions are ridiculous. As Arion mentioned, she'd be crawling around on all fours. And I just feel like society has moved beyond women having to do that. And for children seeing that from the start of life and thinking, hey, that's pretty normal, more realistic Barbies, more inclusive Barbies reflecting all the great range, and being like, oh my God, what is that, when they see a person who looks different to them or has a visible disability in real life, because that's painful for the person who has to deal with that all the time.
Okay, indeed. If anyone from Mattel is listening, can you please make me a nerdy Jewish G.I. Joe? Thanks. My thanks to Arion, Suchandrika, and Julia. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.